Two cold, rigid bodies. A locked house with no signs of forced entry, no cries for help. Gene Hackman, the Hollywood legend, ended his life in absolute silence beside his wife, beneath the dimming lights of Old Glory. Was it a self-inflicted ending, or a carefully staged one? No one knows. Only the unspoken secrets remain. Gene's grandson spoke up, but a single vague statement unleashed the darkest theories once the Hollywood lights faded. All that remained were the cold bodies and the unresolved mystery still lingering. The villa stood amidst the barren land of Santa Fe, silent and solitary like an isolated oasis in the desert. The thick adobe walls, stained with the colors of time, enveloped the lives of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa in their final days. Like a cocoon of silence holding on to every sound of life, or even the subtle hint of a peaceful end hidden in every corner of the house. The home had witnessed the quietest moments of two people who seemed opposites, but were, in fact, perfectly in harmony. If you're curious about the story of Gene Hackman and the unanswered mysteries, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of the exciting videos we uncover. Now, let's dive into the story. Gene Hackman, a cinematic icon and a man who once lived in the spotlight of Hollywood, has now retreated into a quiet space, far from the flashing lights and noisy interviews. By his side is Betsy Arakawa, a woman whose soft hands glide over the piano keys, providing music that soothes the ups and downs Gene has experienced. A few neighbors around the estate have grown accustomed to the surrounding silence. No parties, no lively gatherings, no signs of disturbance. The last time anyone saw Gene Hackman, he was standing in front of the house, silently observing the vast yard where his loyal dog leisurely strolled. Betsy, with her gray-black dog, her hair and eyes like autumn lakes, would occasionally open the second-floor window, letting the afternoon breeze carry the scent of herbs throughout the house. Then, everything fell silent. No more of Gene's morning walks, no more of Betsy's familiar piano melodies. No more sight of the old dog sunbathing on the porch. An invisible layer enveloped the entire house, and the absolute silence lingered for many days after. Only the maintenance workers, a few people with reason to pass through the heavy wooden gates, were the first to notice the stench. They were familiar with Gene's slow, somewhat elaborate but polite demeanor when they came to work. But this time, no one answered the door. Their knocking became meaningless. Finally, after several days of silence, they were forced to break the lock to enter. The door opened as if lifting a thick curtain hiding the truth. The first thing they saw wasn't signs of struggle or a horrific scene, but simply silence. A silence so perfect it was more terrifying than any scream. No signs of a fight, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. Everything was intact, as though time had stopped. Days before Gene Hackman was found, he lay on the mudroom floor, the transitional space between the front door and the living room. Beside him was his familiar pair of glasses, an essential item for a man nearing 95 years old. The way he was positioned, as described by investigators, seemed as if someone had suddenly collapsed, unable to call for help or grab anything. They noted this in their report, but the source of that suddenness remains unknown. Betsy Arakawa, the woman Gene always referred to as his gentle light, was later found not far away. She lay in the bathroom near the entrance, surrounded by medicine bottles, essentials for a woman over 60. But this time, their presence made the scene even more uncertain. There were no signs of forced medication, no mess, no cries for help, just the silence that lasted until she was discovered. The dog, her loyal companion, also lay still, as if it had chosen to depart with its owner. No wounds, no struggle, as if it had simply fallen asleep in a house that was once filled with the warmth of two people. The sheriff arrived and began investigating, but all they found was silence, strange traces, and unanswered questions. The deaths of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa remain a great mystery, and their story, the legend of him and the woman by his side, continues to leave an unfinished mark in the flow of time. When death leaves behind questions, the heavy wooden door closed behind the investigation team, the creak of the hinges echoing down the long hallway back to the mansion. The only sound left after many days was the absolute silence. Dim light from the square window filtered through thin silk curtains, casting a soft golden glow on the wooden floor, where Gene Hackman had once stood, one hand holding his glasses, the other gently resting on the window frame, staring into the endless desert before him. But the man now lay there on the cold wooden floor, not far from the front door. His stillness seemed frozen in a half moment, as if his body had suddenly been pulled down by an invisible force, without warning, without resistance, without a cry for help. Only the glasses lay quietly beside his cold hand. It was called a sudden fall, a type of fall for those who don't realize what has just happened to them. From the living room, the path to the bathroom, where Betsy Arakawa was found, was not far. But in that silent atmosphere, it suddenly felt like an endless distance. On the cold tile floor, Betsy lay on her side, her dark hair now partially fallen, obscuring her face. Surrounding her were her empty medicine bottles, scattered with a few unconsumed pills. No blood, no mess. Everything was oddly tidy, as if someone had rearranged the scene according to a perfect script. The first question that came to the investigators' minds: did Betsy choose to leave the world quietly, or did someone help her do so? The pills were not enough to conclude anything. The dosage was too low to cause immediate departure, but enough to turn her into a dreamy, tranquil woman, gradually sinking into eternal sleep. Santa Fe police confirmed there were no signs of forced entry. The windows, front door, and all exits remained intact, with no evidence of external interference. Either Gene or Betsy, but that absolute integrity opened up a dark realm of unanswered questions. If there was no intruder, if no attack occurred, then what truly happened between the two who once loved each other, living quietly together in peace, and then left together without leaving a message? Death is filled with whispers among those involved, like a temporary explanation for this simultaneous tragedy, a secret pact between the two that had reached the end of their journey, deciding to hold hands and cross the final boundary in the quietest way possible. But if it was an agreement, where's the evidence? No suicide note, no last words hastily scribbled in a notebook or on a newspaper. The only signs were the pill bottles in their bodies, positioned differently as if they spent their final hours alone, perhaps only a few steps apart. The more the house was explored, the more it resembled a stage after the curtain had fallen, where all the main characters had quietly withdrawn once the play ended. But that play had no final line, no audience, only a dense, haunting silence that made even the most seasoned investigators shudder in that space. Only the old dog remained as the silent witness to the story. It lay at the foot of the sofa, eyes closed, body rigid, with no wounds, no signs of struggle, as if it had chosen to leave with the two who had cared for it for so many years. A simultaneous departure, without sound, without trace. This chilling coincidence reinforced the theory of their deaths. What could cause two people and an animal to stop at the same time in the same space? An invisible, undetected toxin, illness, or simply a silent agreement? No words, no paperwork, just one last glance, and everything closed? Betsy collapsed beside the pills, but her hand was not clenched as is often seen in suicide cases. Instead, her fingers were relaxed, her hand slightly open, as if someone had gently laid her down, repositioned her, and wiped the last beads of sweat from her forehead. Gene, with his glasses lying beside him, seemed as though he was about to pick them up to look at the face of the woman he loved. But before his hand could reach, everything ended. No one knows for sure what happened behind the closed doors of the Santa Fe mansion. The pills, silent like the house, the adobe walls soaked with secrets no one can decipher. Only the questions continue to knock at the minds of all who knew Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa. What truly drove them to cross the final boundary together, yet still haunt with solitude? The news of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa's passing was not just a tragic event in the entertainment world, but a small earthquake, causing a series of aftershocks that lasted for weeks. The media, like predators, sensed the scent of blood and surrounded the adobe estate in Santa Fe, trying to gather every fragment of the story from quiet neighbors, delivery people, those who had knocked on the door, and the couple's old friends. When the police confirmed there were no signs of forced entry, no external force, the atmosphere remained thick with mystery. No signs of violence, no clear suicide note, just two silent bodies in a perfect space, like a stage set up for a final act. This only fueled the collective imagination, and thus, conspiracy theories grew like poisonous mushrooms on the damp ground after a rainstorm. No one dared rule out the possibility, especially when the simultaneous departure of both Gene and Betsy, along with their loyal dog, evoked images of gas poisoning or chemical exposure. Conspiracy theorists combed through Gene Hackman's property records, dug into old plumbing repairs, and speculated a scenario of a silent gas leak, gently paralyzing the nervous system and sending all three living beings in the house into eternal sleep. The phrase, "death's embrace," emerged from nowhere, but it quickly clung to the case like an haunting shadow. Gene Hackman, the star who conquered Hollywood, chose to depart without fanfare. No fireworks, only the quiet pills beside his beloved wife. At 95, with his former glory now just a faint echo, did Hackman choose to quietly step away with the woman he considered his final harbor? The media dug deep into their private lives, from their peaceful marriage in the 1980s to every rare appearance of Betsy alongside her husband. Before the cameras, She disliked the noise, and everyone knew that. But that silence had now become a hunting ground for rumors. They spoke of signs of trouble. Hackman growing increasingly reclusive, Betsy canceling doctor appointments without clear reasons, both of them shrinking their world into the 4 adobe walls where no one truly knew what had happened inside. Depression and declining health were a more acceptable scenario to the public. Betsy, a quiet and introverted Japanese woman, had struggled with chronic depression for years. Gene, old and frail, no longer had the strength to care for his wife, sinking into the darkness of her mind. Their mutual dependence became a burden, turning love into a secret pact, where both decided to end it before either had to survive in loneliness. But the theories didn't stop there. News hounds dug into Hackman's family history. His first marriage to Faye Maltz ended after 30 years, leaving lasting rifts with his 3 children. Their father-son relationships had never been fully healed, and now they were under scrutiny. There were tense phone calls, not just disputes over the will's assets, but the familiar sparks that come when an icon grows older. Those silent disagreements indirectly pushed Gene and Betsy into a corner of despair. And then, in the dark forums where conspiracy theories intertwine with urban legends, an old concept resurfaced. The Hollywood curse. Icons of the past, from Marilyn Monroe to Heath Ledger to Robin Williams, didn't die from old age or illness, but from an invisible curse that haunted screen legends until their final moments. Gene Hackman, who left Hollywood to live longer if he truly escaped it, had now become the center of wild speculation. Tim Hackman, Gene's grandson, was forced to speak out. His voice echoed on national television. "I ask everyone to stop speculating about things that are not true. Our family is waiting for the toxicology results. Please respect that." But it was that very phrase, "Our family is waiting for the toxicology results," that unintentionally added fuel to the fire. Waiting for the toxicology results meant the Hackman family did not rule out the possibility that some kind of toxin had infiltrated their final days. What were they afraid of? What had they done? Suspicion, born from unanswered questions, cast a thick shadow of mystery under the cold flashlight outside the Santa Fe house. The media and the public stood together, waiting for a truth, or at least a plausible explanation. But for a legend who had spent a lifetime in both light and darkness, perhaps the truth would never be bright enough to satisfy everyone. As the flashlights outside the adobe house in Santa Fe flickered endlessly, none of them truly understood that behind the rustic wooden walls, the tragedy of Gene Hackman was not just limited to 2 deaths, but also the echo of old cracks. Unanswered phone calls, unsent letters, and names once familiar now only heard through news snippets. Christopher Hackman, the eldest son, had once been Gene's childhood pride. That boy had sat on his famous father's shoulders when Gene received his first Oscar, but no one could imagine that Hollywood was also the thing that drove them apart. As Christopher entered his teenage years, Gene had become an unattainable name, not just because of his fame, but also because of the continuous film projects, months-long shoots, press conferences, and red carpet events. Christopher grew up in his father's absence, and with each passing year, that absence became a lingering scar in his heart. For Elizabeth and Leslie Hackman, Gene and his first wife, Faye Maltz, and their 2 daughters, things were even more complicated. Elizabeth once said in a rare interview in the early 2000s, "We learned to live without recognition from our father, not with bitterness, not with resentment, just with weary acceptance." As if Gene's children understood they could never outshine the blinding light Hollywood had placed on their father. If you're intrigued by this story, leave a comment with the number 1. If not, leave a comment with the number 2. And don't forget to hit like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's continue this exciting journey with us. When Gene divorced Faye Maltz in 1986, after 30 years together, the Hackman family fell apart. Faye took their 3 children away from the massive shadow of Gene Hackman, leaving a void that was never filled. People say Gene loved his children, but he never knew how to be a father, especially when fame whispered in his ear that he was a legend, not just an ordinary dad. In the 90s, when Gene remarried Betsy Arakawa, his relationship with his 3 children grew even more distant. No one hated Betsy, but her presence was a reminder that their father had created an entirely new world, a world without them. The infrequent calls gradually faded away. Thanksgiving or Christmas gatherings became impossible. Gene and Betsy lived in their own little world, while the Hackman children grew up labeled as the offspring of a legend, yet no one really knew them. Then, the fateful call came early one morning, when the phones of Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie rang almost simultaneously. On the other end was a Santa Fe police officer, a steady voice carrying the weight of 30 years of distance. "We need to inform you Mr. Gene Hackman and Mrs. Betsy Arakawa have passed away at their home." No one truly knew how the Hackman children felt in that moment. Shocked, empty, regretful, or just a sense that everything was too late. The 3 children had avoided their father for many years, now forced to face the name Hackman once again. Not on screen, not through rumors, but through real pain. Death beyond the media gnawed at every bit of news about the tension between father and children, old family photos of the Hackmans when they were happy. Gene quietly sent birthday gifts no one opened, while everyone dug up everything from stories about Hackman missing his children's graduations to rumors that Christopher had changed his name to escape his father's shadow. And then, everyone focused on the question of whether they truly loved their father, or if Gene Hackman was ultimately just a screen legend, nothing more. The truth is always more complex. Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie, despite the pain, anger, and resentment, were still Hackman's children. Beneath the dust of time, under the unhealable cracks, something fragile but unbroken remained. The blood bond. But that bond, instead of bringing them closer, became a rope tightening around their necks for years. When Gene truly left, when Betsy lay cold beside him, the Hackman children had no choice but to face the past. There was no one left to blame, no one left to reconcile with, no more chances to start over. All that remained was the silence, the very thing that had torn them apart, now enveloping the entire family. And in that silence, Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie had only one choice: stand together and face their father's legacy, deciding who they would be, those who carried the Hackman name or those who would forever run from it. As the door of the Santa Fe house closed behind the investigation team, outside the iron gates, the media continued to dig up old stories about Gene Hackman. Dusty photos from the 70s and 80s flooded online news pages. Gene in tuxedo at the Oscars, Gene with co-stars on set, Gene and Betsy shaking hands at a charity event. But there were no photos of the Hackman children with their father. It was a void no one could fill for a long time. Gene Hackman's story was portrayed by Hollywood as a symbol of rising above adversity. The young man left home, slept on park benches, took on odd jobs to pursue his dream of filmmaking. But what no one mentioned, or deliberately ignored, was the price he had to pay for it. The glory for his family when Gene Hackman walked down the red carpet accepting his Oscar statuette. His 3 children, Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie, sat in front of the TV, watching their father as if he were a stranger. The rare handwritten letters he sent, the brief phone calls, or the fleeting summer encounters couldn't fill the father-child gap that Hollywood had swallowed whole. When Gene remarried Betsy Arakawa, a new chapter began for him, but it closed with his children. Christopher once told an old friend, "I don't hate Betsy, she's kind, gentle, and always polite, but I never felt like I belonged there." Betsy was the woman Gene loved to the end, but she also unknowingly became the barrier that separated Gene from his grown children. Years later, when Hackman retired to live peacefully in Santa Fe, his children still did not return. Not because of hatred or resentment, but because they didn't know where to begin. The years of silence had stretched on too long, to the point where their father's presence had become a distant concept. And then, death brought them back, with the media surrounding and behind-the-scenes stories being unearthed. Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie were forced to become the bearers of the key to their father's final chapter. Every question from the police, every news report from the press, every curious glance from the public, all felt like needles piercing a wound they thought had long healed. Christopher, the eldest son, became the representative of the reluctant. He was the one who signed the papers to transfer his parents' bodies to the morgue, the one who answered questions from the media on behalf of the family. Though his heart was filled with unresolved conflicts, it was a responsibility no one wanted but could not avoid. Elizabeth, the middle daughter, living quietly in a coastal town in Oregon, declined all interviews. But in a private letter to the family lawyer, she wrote, "I have nothing to say about my father. My only wish is that he may rest in peace." Leslie, the youngest daughter, had tried to break into the film industry but quickly gave it up, unable to bear the shadow of Gene Hackman. She is now a kindergarten teacher. In a brief call with Santa Fe police, Leslie cried, not because of the pain of losing her father, but because 30 years of silence had now become permanent. The division within the Hackman family was not loud, with no media battles, no tell-all memoirs. All they had was the void, one no one dared to fill. Hollywood loved stories of reconciliation, tearful reunions, hugs that resolve all misunderstandings. But the real life of Gene Hackman and his children was not a movie script. There was no happy ending, no final moment together to forgive. Only unsent messages, calls no one dared to make, and now, 2 cold graves in the heart of Santa Fe. But whether they wanted it or not, the three Hackman children remained the ultimate heirs to Gene Hackman's legacy. Not only the wealth, but also the rumors surrounding his fame and the behind-the-scenes stories they never wanted to discuss in public. They were not just Christopher, Elizabeth, or Leslie. They were the children of Gene Hackman, and that would follow them for the rest of their lives. At the private funeral under the gray skies of New Mexico, as the first handfuls of dirt fell, no one knew what the three children felt. Perhaps sorrow, perhaps relief, perhaps a mix of emotions no one could name. But one thing was certain. Beneath the tombstone bearing Gene Hackman's name lay not just a resting legend, but the fragments of a family no one wanted to speak of. In the world of Hollywood legends, where the spotlight often conceals the darkest truths, death is sometimes not the end, but the beginning of an unrelenting pursuit. Such was the case with Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa, as two names once symbolizing fulfillment in their later years were suddenly tied to an unresolved mystery. Everything the public knew, everything the media speculated, were merely assumptions. No one was truly present in their home on that fateful night, and when the forensic lab doors closed, only blood remained as the one piece of evidence that couldn't lie. One might assume a tragedy involving prescription drugs. If we were to believe the most familiar Hollywood scenarios, it's easy to imagine an elderly couple physically exhausted after years of battling illness, comforting each other with tranquilizers and painkillers, one pill, then two. As the physical and emotional pain wore down their final reserves, the dosage gradually increased like a flawed survival instinct, eventually surpassing the limit. Not suicide, not murder, just a quiet, gentle, and bitter accident. If toxicology reports confirm this, the media would describe a Gene Hackman in declining health, alone in his own home. A discouraged Betsy, struggling to be the support for her once glorious husband, now nothing more than a fading stone statue. While this image may not directly overturn the narrative, Gene Hackman exposes a side no one wants to remember: the true cost of too much lasting glory. Imagine two quiet packages between two lonely souls, with no one knowing what Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa discussed within those stone walls. So, let's assume they whispered to each other about a complete departure. When journeys no longer bring joy, when calls from loved ones gradually fade, and when every meal is just two silent chairs. Perhaps they had agreed to leave together, no fanfare, no warning. If toxicology finds signs of an overdose taken together with a clear purpose, the story would turn into pure tragedy. Two souls choosing to go together in a romantic death, perhaps. But would the public accept it? Hollywood had once honored Gene Hackman as an unyielding icon, a man who never backed down. So what if he was the one to ultimately close the curtain on his life? Imagine three simple accidents, where old age becomes a trap. The simplest hypothesis: one can't rule out a gas leak, a faulty heating device. No drugs, no conspiracy, no life and death pact, just old, tired life itself as the killer. If the autopsy results suggest this, the media might momentarily step back. A pure tragedy, no one to blame, not even fate. But would anyone believe in the perfect coincidence at the heart of Hollywood? The unspoken assumption of the curse of aging icons. No one says it out loud, but Gene Hackman's children must have felt it vaguely, living too long under the shadow of Hollywood. The spotlight is a curse, with every old friend, every former colleague, every familiar face gradually disappearing, leaving Gene and Betsy adrift in a world they once revered. Suppose, in their blood, they found traces of painkillers, stimulants mixed together as a temporary remedy for lonely, aging souls. It's neither a crime nor a scandal, just the sad, timeless story of icons who never learned how to age. When the results reflect family, regardless of the toxicology reports, regardless of whose truth it is, the Hackman children still must face their father's legacy. They are the final witnesses to a legend, but they are also the children who grew up in the void between a famous father and a real father. Now, as the blood speaks, they carry not only the legacy of fame, but also the questions they never dared to ask. Were their parents truly happy? Did they ever feel fear? And did Hollywood's glory swallow them whole? These assumptions are just that. Assumptions, not reflections of reality. Gene Hackman may have passed away in peaceful sleep or in an unforeseen tragedy. But whether the story of his death is real or just imagination, it will remain the material for the media and the public to shape the final image of a legend. And sometimes the wildest assumptions are the closest to the truth. The conclusion, when the legend falls, is the echo that never dies. Gene Hackman left without applause, without a farewell song. Only a strange silence, filled with fragmented news. He left behind a brilliant career, a film legacy large enough to fill a museum. But behind that velvet curtain was a patched-together family and scarred memories no one wanted to embrace. The three children, Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie, finally stood on the same side, not to protect the monument of Gene Hackman, not to repaint the portrait of an immortal father, but simply to face the stark truth. The man who made the world bow in respect was never the father they could proudly call by name. Hollywood adored him for his brilliant roles. The media hailed him as a symbol of courage and strength. But in his own home, he was just a shadow, sometimes too distant, sometimes too suffocating, and sometimes completely vanished. The echo of Gene Hackman is not found in memorial articles or special screenings, in missed calls no one answers, in birthday parties without a father, in emails written and deleted, or in hugs never given. We knew him as a legend, but we lost him as a father. A single phrase closes the door on all illusions about the legend. Amid the Hollywood lights, the monument of Gene Hackman stands flawless. But in the memories of the children he left behind, the true legacy is a broken family and a father who was never perfect. Gene Hackman, a fallen legend, but the aftershocks of his fame, damaged by unanswered questions, will echo forever like a lost echo between the shores of fame and family. Thank you for watching the story of Gene Hackman and the Unanswered Mysteries. Let us know which movie you first saw Gene Hackman in and how you felt after watching the video. Don't forget to hit like, share, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Thank you, and see you in the next video.